Hello and welcome to the world's biggest military air show, the Royal International Air Tattoo. We're at RAF Fairford in the Cotswolds, which has been home to this event since 1985, and this year the show is marking some important anniversaries. In this programme we'll be looking at the Lockheed C-130 Hercules, still going strong after 50 years. We'll be celebrating the centenary of the Entente Cordiale. We'll be seeing spectacular displays from some of today's frontline combat aircraft. And we'll be looking back 60 years to see how air power played a vital part in the D-Day landings. That's all to come, but we start with the national display team of Switzerland, La Patrie Suisse. They fly the F-5, and for this show they've been joined by a special guest, as you'll see in a moment. To describe the action, it's over to Sean Maffett.
The Patrie Suisse are great favourites at Royal International Air Tattoos. They're very reliable, as you might expect of the Swiss, but they're also great fun in their displays, and their little F-5 aircraft look almost like toys in this beautiful red and white colour scheme, the national colours of Switzerland, of course. They look a bit like Thunderbirds. But today, they're joined by something rather sinister, something much bigger. This is the Swiss Air Force FA-18C Hornet, another American aircraft. And today, a rare occasion when we're going to see the 6 aircraft of the Patrie Suisse flying with their own FA-18C Hornet. The Swiss emblem proudly emblazoned underneath. The Hornet apparently trailing smoke, but actually it's just condensation trails from the wingtips. Captain Michael Reiner in the cockpit of the F-18 here, and that is smoke on either side of him, the smoke from the Patrie Suisse. He pulls up and out of the formation to start his own solo display. Pulling up into the vertical with Fairford's runway right behind him, looking over his shoulder to see where he is in relation to the airfield. More condensation as he comes down the slope on the far side. And we can hear Michael Reiner's thoughts on using the F-18 for air displays.
It is a good display airplane compared to other airplanes. That is certainly nose authority. It can pitch very fast. It is very good controllable. Roll rate is more than a second for a full roll. So it doesn't roll too fast, not as fast as the small aerobatic airplane does, but it's still fairly good for a jet weighing 17 tons. The maximum G positive is 8 G positive, and negative G, it's just 1 negative G in the inverted flight. It is only a 10 minutes flight. You know what you did afterwards.
The sound of those 2 big General Electric turbofans powering the 18C round its display. And here demonstrating its naval antecedents with its tail hook down at the back of the aircraft there. Of course, Switzerland, being a landlocked country, has no need for aircraft carriers, but nonetheless the tail hook is still used. And here, back on centre stage, are La Patrie Suisse in a formation that they call Spear. But not for long, because like all formation teams, they change very rapidly. Here into Doppelpfeil, double wedge formation. And here the 2 solos, Captain Ziggy Siegenthaler and Captain Mesu Müttelhaler, in a Kreuzung, a crossing. The other 4 aircraft, led by the team leader, Lieutenant Colonel Danny Hörsli, and 4 aircraft there celebrating the 40th anniversary of this national team. They rather charmingly call this the flirt. front aircraft upside down, the other aircraft rolling around its wake. It's interesting to see this degree of agility because the F-5 is an older generation of aircraft. It's not particularly well suited to being a display aircraft. Nonetheless, the Swiss, as ever, use it perfectly. And here, this is called shadow. This is an extraordinary formation. They look as if they're absolutely welded together. Now one of their favourites, the tunnel. Switzerland, of course, is full of tunnels. And the man about to fly through the tunnel is Captain Ziggy Siegenthaler. La Patrouille Suisse, always great favourites at any air show.
The Lockheed C-130 Hercules, one of the most successful aircraft ever built. Now 50 years old, it's used in 67 countries. The type has been adapted for numerous tasks. It's played a part in every major conflict of its time, and Riat has seen many demonstrations of its capabilities. So here on its golden jubilee of flypast by aircraft from the United States Air Force at Mildenhall, C-130 is quite comfortable at low speed. Here it's doing only about 120 knots, and that means it can refuel helicopters. That allows teams from a combat rescue unit to reach deep into enemy territory that would otherwise be out of range. But the type has many non-combat roles. This aircraft is based with the 53rd Weather Reconnaissance Squadron at Keesler Air Force Base in Mississippi. When a hurricane approaches America's eastern seaboard, C-130s will be on station around the clock. Flying in the teeth of the storm, they can gather data on its progress.
There are times when you can't see the center of a storm because it's covered by clouds. And by flying the aircraft in through the storm, that allows you to directly measure that information, which improves the warnings for the public.
Data is gathered by a drop sonde. The parachute device is released through a tube to descend into the ocean.
It measures temperature, pressure, humidity, and wind speed and wind direction. So it uses GPS satellites to calculate wind speed and wind direction, and then it has other sensors built in that measures pressure, temperature, and humidity. And it falls at about 2,500 feet per minute and radios back that information twice a second to the aircraft computers.
Flirting with the turbulence of tropical storms has meant some wild rides for the crews.
A few years ago in Hurricane Mitch, we had a sudden drop of the aircraft for about 1,000 feet, and our drop-zone operator in the airplane was unstrapped at the time and ended up on the ceiling of the airplane. So it does get exciting and rough once in a while.
The C-130 Tactical Demonstration Team shows how the aircraft can deliver combat-ready troops and vehicles. It can operate into rough strips as short as 2,500 feet and be away in moments. This is exactly what happened during the invasion of Iraq. In the days before the arrival of the main ground units, special forces were flown in to secure key installations. The first US aircrew to land in Iraq are here at Fairford. Operating by night, they used the runway of an abandoned airfield, landing between the craters caused by an earlier bomb attack.
It was a total of 4 C-130s that loaded up. We infiltrated across the border around 10 o'clock at night. The lead aircraft made the first landing and reported back that the runway was good, successful. He was able to offload his vehicles and troops. My aircraft came in and landed behind the lead aircraft. At the end of the surveyed strip, the crater had kind of impinged on the runway, so you had to swerve off to the right a little bit to avoid getting your tires caught up in that. We pulled clear onto the taxiway, offloaded the vehicles and the Special Forces guys, and then our 2 ship departed. We were followed minutes later by the 2 Talon 2s with their load as well, so that within the matter of about 10 or 12 minutes, we had 8 vehicles and about 50 or 60 Special Forces guys on the ground out in the western desert. The
RAF has 50 C-130s based at nearby Lynham. One aircraft from each of Lynham's 4 squadrons took part in a flypast. The aircraft in the middle are the older K model, which can be identified by the underwing fuel tanks. On the outside, the new glass cockpit J model, which is having a troublesome entry into service. Engine problems have yet to be resolved. Both the K and J versions are used for parachuting. At Brize Norton, the RAF's Falcons here prepare to drop into Fairford with a team from the French Air Force.
These guys are professionals, they're ex-world champions. They've done thousands and thousands of jumps, where we've done 600, 700 jumps. So we're at the start of our career, those guys are at the pinnacle of their career.
It's the biggest show I've seen, you know. And that's the first time I jump on the big air show like this. For me it's very amazing.
Well, this very elegant colour scheme on the BAE Systems Hawk of the Royal Air Force is there to celebrate 30 years of service of this training aircraft. And 30 years also mentioned on the aircraft of the Midnight Hawks from Finland. Now, this is the first time they've displayed in Britain. It's only the second time they've ever displayed outside their own country. But why are they called the Midnight Hawks?
We are flying since '97. It's starting to call Midnight Hawks, and the name came because we are usually flying at the Midsummer Festival at midnight. I've been flying it a little over 10 years now. A little old, but a good plane and very easy to fly, so I like it.
So as they get airborne off the runway, they immediately get themselves into a tight little box formation. Formation flying has a long history in the Finnish Air Force. Back in the 1920s, they used to fly formations of seaplanes at air shows. And the Midnight Hawks themselves, their history can be traced back to before the Second World War, when the Air Force Academy used Gloucester Gamecocks. In fact, the formation flying has become a trademark feature of the Air Academy's annual Midnight Summer Air Show. Nowadays they have 2 teams. They have their basic flying trainers, the Finnish-made Valmet Vinca, and this BAE Systems Hawk. And landing here in close formation, and interestingly, all of them touching down at almost exactly the same time. A very nice, precise ending to the display of the Finnish Midnight Hawks.
Well, from one Hawk display team to another. The Red Arrows are also celebrating an anniversary. This is their 40th display season and their 25th year flying the Hawk.
There you go. Thank you very much. Cheers.
The Reds have become a British institution and the pilots are treated like showbiz celebrities. But earlier this year, their leader, Spike Jepson, was reportedly saying that the team might be axed to save money. Jepson says his remarks were taken out of context, but the team cannot be complacent about its future.
What I do think is important to put on record is that as the Red Arrows, each year we work extremely hard to make sure we're delivering value. We're always assessing what we do and looking at new ways to develop what we do to ensure that the taxpayer is getting value for money. And the one thing that we cannot do is take that for granted. And each year the defence budget looks carefully at what it can and cannot afford, and we can't sit here and assume that we're safe. And that's the message that I was trying to get across.
It takes 100 people to keep the Red Arrows flying, so they don't come cheap. But, as with most things, you get what you pay for. For 40 years, the team has been a brilliant advertisement for Britain and the RAF. And surely no government would dare to allow all this to go up in smoke.
Well, in 2003, this aircraft flew in formation with the Red Arrows. It was a fantastic spectacle. This year, despite the fact that everybody looks forward to seeing these stealth aircraft fly at air shows, there's a sense of disappointment about it. This is the Stealth Fighter. It's really a bomber, but it's called the Stealth Fighter because it's rather smaller than the other stealth aircraft, which is the Stealth Bomber. It's actually the F-117A Nighthawk. But all it's allowed to do these days is completely flat flypasts. It used to do a curved flypast, which meant that you got a good view of the upper surface of the aircraft. But for some reason, they've stopped it doing that. The pilots are not particularly happy about that, but apparently it's on orders from above, something to do with extra security. But here we see it landing, and once again, one is struck by how totally sinister this aircraft does look. But of course, the aircraft that people really want to see is the Northrop Grumman B-2A Spirit, that stealth bomber, accompanied as always by two F-15 fighters. And despite the fact that this is on a 20-hour round trip non-stop from its base in Missouri, it's not allowed to do more than one flypast. It's strange because in the past it's actually been allowed to land at the Tattoo, not on this occasion.
So, a very brief and distant flypast by the stealth bomber. If you wanted a close-up look at something stealthy, it was here in the static park. This is JUCAS. It stands for Joint Unmanned Combat Air System. You can see at once that this pilotless aircraft comes from the same makers as the B-2. It's due to fly in 2007, and in addition to its surveillance role, it will carry bombs.
If you have a highly sensitive intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance aircraft, and it finds a lucrative target out there, and then it takes a half hour or an hour to bring strike assets to bear, and that's a highly mobile target, it may have disappeared. So in order to compress what they call the sensor-to-shooter timeline, why not put weapons on the sensor aircraft? The key multiple missions will be precision strike, suppression of enemy air defenses, electronic attack, and intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and targeting, which is the classic mission that all UAVs were originally designed for.
The other question, which I'm sure a lot of people here would like answered, is when are we going to see an aircraft like this fly at a show like this?
Well, we start flying in 2007, and if we're doing really, really well, maybe we'll shoot for 2008. We'd like to fly it here.
So we could see this at the Royal International Air Tattoo?
I would hope we could.
Also on display, the Fire Scout, an unmanned helicopter that will stay airborne for up to 12 hours at 20,000 feet. You could say that these are the ultimate radio-controlled models. There can be no doubt that aircraft like this will play an ever-increasing role in future conflicts.
Now here's an aircraft that everybody was very keen to see. This is the first demonstration by a Royal Air Force Typhoon. This is Eurofighter, the Royal Air Force calls it Typhoon. And we've not seen the Royal Air Force crews displaying this aircraft before. So, a big moment for RIAT 2004. Of course, this is a controversial aeroplane. Britain is buying 232 of these, and there are questions about whether we need that many. It is very expensive. But controversy aside, it is now in service with the Royal Air Force on 2 squadrons, 29 Squadron and 17. This is a 17 Squadron aircraft with the squadron markings on the side, and it's being flown by the commanding officer of 29 Squadron, and like all the pilots, he's very happy about how this aircraft handles.
One of the major problems that people have in the very first few sorties is that the power is just so immense that it can get away from you. But after you settle down after a couple of hours, then you learn to control that power, and you can see the potential in the airframe. The airframe and the engine combination is tremendous. I mean, she flies exceptionally well. She's very easy to fly, but she goes like an absolute dream. And, we're all fairly hardened and cynical people in the Royal Air Force, or in terms of the older aircrew anyway. And I can think of no better way of describing the aircraft as my guys get out of the cockpit with a big smile on their face. And you don't see that every day.
Interestingly, this is the 2-seat trainer version of the aircraft. The operational version is a single-seater, and you will only see it flown by the Royal Air Force with 2 pilots on board. They're insisting on having a safety pilot until some possible control problems that were thrown up in the acceptance process for the aircraft have been resolved. But despite that, and despite the expense, the Royal Air Force thinks it's got a winner in Typhoon.
One of the anniversary themes of Riat 2004 was the centenary of the Entente Cordiale, the pact of friendship between British and French governments. The countries have been involved in many joint aviation ventures, not least Concorde, which began its test programme here at Fairford. The man tasked with making this a spectacular celebration was explosives expert Charlie Adcock. His team was asked to create a huge red, white and blue flag as a French Mirage and British Jaguar flew overhead, plus other pyro effects for a D-Day reenactment later in the show.
Getting on close to 200 kilos of explosive. We've had about 36 tonnes of peat delivered, 10 tonnes of powdered limestone, 20 tonnes of sand, basically just to simulate Earth and make it look, like a real bomb hit would. And we fired over a mile of detonating cord.
Spectacular it was, though the flag of fire soon lost its colours in the wind. A more enduring example of Anglo-French cooperation was to come later with the completion of a project supported by the Royal International Air Tattoo. In the First World War, more than 50,000 British airmen served on the Western Front. An appeal at Fairford has helped to raise funds for a permanent memorial to their efforts and sacrifice. It was unveiled in September at Saint-Omer near Calais. The airfield was headquarters for the air arm of the British Expeditionary Force. The memorial came about after a visit from an RAF Air Commodore 4 years ago.
Although it was much that had been left some 90 years ago, there was no indication of how important it was to Britain and to the Royal Air Force in particular. I've been hugely encouraged at the support we've received from countless individuals, a lot of veterans' families, but also corporate organisations. And what you see here today is a result of their collective effort. I should also say we've had tremendous support from the town of Saint-Omer and the French people. They deeply appreciate what the Royal Air Force and Britain did for them in 2 world wars. And so on this, the 100th anniversary year of the Entente Cordiale, it's a tremendous opportunity to reflect on our shared history.
Back at Fairford, an appearance by La Patrie de France. Links between British and French aviators remained strong, but on this occasion a joint venture failed to materialise. On the Friday of the show there were plans for a 17-aircraft formation flypast by La Patrie and the Red Arrows, but it had to be cancelled due to poor weather. On the 2 other days the French gave a fine performance in their Alpha jets, as you'd expect from one of the world's great display teams.
Now these 2 aircraft, they're Lynx helicopters, are from 702 Naval Air Squadron. They call themselves the Black Cats. And when I said that at an air show the other day, somebody said, but they're grey, why do they call themselves black? Well, the thing is that they're both Lynxes, and the squadron crest of 702 Naval Air Squadron is a Lynx, which is a black cat. And the squadron motto is Cave Ungue Felis, watch out for the cat's claws. So, here they are, the Black Cats. They're a champion, prize-winning display team from the Royal Navy. In the lead aircraft, on the right-hand side, the captain, Lieutenant Dave Turner, and on his left, the observer, Lieutenant Joe Dransfield. Dave is going to talk us through his display.
Now pulling into a decelerating 60-degree flat turn, so end up on the display line at crowd centre in an opposing, to join together in the hover. Here I am decelerating now, looking to come together, pull off all the speed right at the end there, and then turning round to face the crowd, and I'm now going to move forwards and landing on. Now Lynx got a fairly unique capability because we land on ships. We have to be able to move. Sometimes the ship can't manoeuvre, so before we take off we sometimes have to use the cast ring system, so the nose wheel turns through 90 degrees, and then I'm feeding some pedal. And there we are, just turning. We're sat on the ground at the moment, spinning around. The other aircraft's behind me in the hover, and also doing a spot turn in the opposite direction, which I'm just coordinate that with him looking like he's doing it on top of my rotor blades. So as we come back round into the centre of the crowd now, pulling up off the deck and then climbing up to 300 feet. The other aircraft directly behind me. This stage facing the crowd, just easing the aircraft backwards. And there's the nose over, so 90 degrees nose down, now rolling through 360 degrees now to come back to crowd centre, using up to a 60 degrees angle of bank, just easing the speed off as we come around the corner. At this point, start to see the other aircraft now, because we're opposing each other on this manoeuvre, so coordinating each other so we don't actually turn into each other is quite important at that stage. Up towards the crowd then, and now turning to face each other. And we're now going to do a turn, a spot turn, turning around each other. As we're coming around, good wave to the other crew because they're fairly close at this stage. And just trying to follow each other around in a nice circle through 360 degrees. To come back to original position. And again now we're just about to climb. Again, climbing through now to 300 feet, turning back to face the crowd. And again, another nose over. This time we're next to each other and doing this in synchronised. Whereas the one before, he was behind me. So nose down, 90 degrees nose down, rolling on the bank now. And again, turning through 360 degrees to come back round, back to the crowd. And looking to bring ourselves back in at crowd centre on the display line. Easing into the hover now. And now what we're going to do is a pirouette. So it's both aircraft moving sideways whilst turning around, using again unique characteristics of the helicopter. They're able to manoeuvre in the hover. The other aircraft's mirroring exactly what I'm doing, so we get fairly close here. You can just see the other aircraft coming round as we spin through the first 180 degrees there. I've now got my back to him as I'm coming around. I continue my turn. Steve will stop at this sort of point, so when I come round now, he'll be facing me. So finishing off, facing along the display line and looking at the other aircraft there.
Now, I think this display is in the best traditions of theatrical entertainment. This manoeuvre looks particularly dangerous, but I know it's not. It just looks like it, and that's what makes it so good. The excellent Black Cats from 702 Naval Air Squadron.
Well, now we come to the section of the show that commemorates the 60th anniversary of the D-Day landings in June 1944. There are plenty of aircraft from that period at Fairford, and part of the site has been turned into a 1940s aerodrome with period costumes and anti-aircraft guns. On the apron are some of the types that provided air support for Allied troops in Normandy, and among them one of the aircraft that was in action on D-Day. Now owned and flown by Caroline Grace, this Mark 9 Spitfire is said to have been the first to engage the enemy as the invasion got underway. Its pilot then was Johnny Holton.
He was leading a formation of 4 and he shot down the first enemy aircraft. It was ministry accreditation on a Ju-88 on D-Day. He then went on to shoot down the second one as well, which he then shared with the rest of his squadron in actual fact.
A less likely war machine was the Miles Messenger. It was slow, unarmed and hardly suited for battle. But in 1944 there were no helicopters, so the Messenger, which could land almost anywhere, was used as a VIP transport. It was in a Messenger that Winston Churchill had his closest call of the war. It came while he was touring the front with Field Marshal Montgomery.
Trevor Martin, who was his pilot, got them all in the aircraft, and of course Monty was pushing Trevor to go nearer and nearer the line, which Trevor had to do. And he was looking along the wing, and all of a sudden he could see little hillocks coming up in his wing, and realised that it was actually small armed ground fire that was going through the wing of the aircraft, and he had the PM in the aircraft with Monty. So they quickly got out of there, as you can imagine.
And of course the thing you notice about this aircraft immediately are the D-Day stripes, the black and white stripes, which were put on so that these aircraft would not be fired on by their own friendly forces. And because it was such a secret, these stripes were mostly only painted 1 or 2 days before the invasion actually started, and everybody was involved in painting them. Ground crew, pilots, the bosses, everybody. So here is Jim Buckingham bringing the little Messenger into land on the grass airstrip, exactly as they would have been doing in all sorts of fields all over northern France. And of course, fields are not always the smoothest of places. You often got a fairly bumpy landing. Of course, in the run-up to the invasion, and indeed during the invasion and afterwards, reconnaissance was absolutely of the essence. And here is one of the aircraft that was carrying out that reconnaissance, the Mark 19 Spitfire, and it's in the classic RAF photo reconnaissance colours of blue with the invasion stripes underneath. And this particular aircraft did do 9 photo reconnaissance sorties before the end of the war with 16 Squadron. Now, we're used to thinking of the Lancaster as a strategic bomber, Perhaps the most famous event was the Dam Busters raid with 617 Squadron. Well, actually, in the early hours of D-Day, 617 had a completely different role. They were flying strange navigational patterns over the channel, and they were dropping long strips of aluminium, which was called rope, not window, rope. And the idea of this was to simulate a huge invasion fleet advancing across the channel towards Calais. So these aircraft were flying a looping line ahead, so that they were creeping ahead at about 8 knots, so that on the German radar this looked like a whole fleet of ships. It was an extraordinary event, and it actually worked. So 617 changed from dropping huge dam-buster bombs to dropping strips of aluminium, but their job was just as important. They did, of course, also drop bombs behind the German lines. This particular Lancaster is one of only 2 left flying in the world. Now, the DC-3 was one of the most important aircraft involved with D-Day. This was the aircraft that carried the paratroops and also sometimes towed the gliders. This particular aircraft comes from the Aviodrome in the Netherlands and is beautifully marked up for D-Day, even to the extent of having that figure 66 by the door. That's marked in chalk, and that tells the paratroops of Chalk 66 that this was the aircraft they had to get onto. So some arrived by parachute, some arrived in gliders. Of course, the gliders we're seeing here are modern ones, because no examples exist of the kind of troop-carrying gliders that were used in this invasion. Meanwhile, as the gliders make their approach to the invasion landing grounds, an Avenger torpedo bomber waits to take off from an airfield somewhere in southern Britain. These modern gliders are representing the wartime troop-carrying gliders such as Hotspur, Horsa, Hamilcar and Hadrian. Some of them had a 110-foot wingspan, and some of them could carry tanks. Meanwhile, the Avenger gets airborne in the hands of its owner, Didier Chable, a Frenchman who has beautifully painted it in D-Day colours. There were 5 squadrons of these aircraft, land-based, along the southern coast of England. They were part of the enormous force that was protecting the invasion fleet from attacks by U-boats, the submarines, and E-boats, the motor torpedo boats. Protecting them from the air were aircraft like this. The RAF called it the Martlet, the Americans called it the Wildcat. So here is the Grumman Avenger torpedo bomber. These aircraft, accompanied by other aircraft from Coastal Command, destroyed 6 German U-boats between the 6th and 10th of June, and after that the Germans gave up their attacks with U-boats. The view from the cockpit of Didier Chable's Avenger as he dives on the airfield. And back to the Martlet fighter, this particular aircraft in the markings of 846 Naval Air Squadron embarked in HMS Tracker. Now, this little aeroplane may look like a Piper Cub. In fact, that's what it is. But this aircraft could instill more fear into troops on the ground than almost any other. There's Howard Cook flying the L-4 Grasshopper, as it was known in military terms. And these aircraft were used for artillery spotting for the big ships, so they could direct enormous firepower onto ground positions by radioing target details back to the ships like HMS Belfast in the Channel. But of course, some aircraft were providing direct close air support to the troops on the ground. Aircraft like these Mustangs, which are perhaps more famous for air-to-air combat. And that air fighting was being done by these Spitfires. Like the Martlet that we saw earlier, they were involved in fighting off the aircraft of the Luftwaffe, not many of which actually appeared on the day. There are the Mustangs in their close air support and strafing the ground. And returning home safely at the end of a ground attack sortie. Also returning home safely, the air defence Spitfires. but the whole D-Day invasion was mounted at enormous cost. In the 3-month period that started on the 6th of June, 16,715 fathers, sons and brothers serving as Allied aircrew were killed or posted missing in these crucial 3 months of the war.
Earlier we saw a Swiss Air Force F-18 Hornet. This is the latest version of the type, the Super Hornet, displayed by its makers Boeing. What turned out to be the star performance of the weekend began with a sedate taxi along the crowd line. The aircraft was in the hands of perhaps the world's most experienced F-18 pilot.
I have about 2,000 hours in the Legacy Hornet, or we call the Legacy Hornet, the A through D model, and about 600 hours now in the Super Hornet. And the two are very similar in flying qualities. There's nothing bad to say about the F-18 A through D. The pilots that fly it love it. It's an excellent airplane. It has great handling qualities, excellent at high alpha. And anyone who's flown it says you cannot improve upon it. And I'm afraid to say that with the Super Hornet we do. It's an absolute joy to fly. We purposely brought the airplane here to demonstrate it in a missionized configuration. We're of the opinion that anyone can fly an air show with the airplane completely cleaned off and nothing on it. But what counts is the aircraft's maneuverability and its agility with a representative weapons load for war. The aircraft is loaded with 6 AIM-120s and 2 AIM-9s, which is a very impressive air-to-air weapons load. The real strong point about the Super Hornet is that in all of its symmetric configurations, as you see it now, with an equal number of missiles on each side or an equal number of bombs on each side, and even for some asymmetry, some amount of weapons missing on one side or the other as the pilot shoots them, there are virtually no limits to the pilot in flying the airplane. Maximum stick inputs in any direction, maximum rudder inputs, and anything that the pilot wants to do with the throttle at virtually any altitude, at any airspeed, and even at any angle of attack. In the configuration in the air show, the airplane has no angle of attack limits of any kind. And so it has truly carefree handling throughout its envelope. And the pilot can spend all of his time concentrating on the enemy and virtually none of his time thinking about the limits of his own airplane and what he should and should not have to do.
Well, you might think that Ricardo Traven is going a bit over the top with that. I mean, he is, after all, a Boeing salesman for his aircraft. But I have to say that this was an absolutely brilliant display. It was recognised as such because he won no less than 3 prizes at the show. That's never happened at a Royal International Air Tattoo before. So he and his aircraft made an absolutely stunning combination. And it was made even better by the fact that, as he said, this aircraft is in a full war load with all of its weapons on board. Dummy weapons, of course, but they weigh the same as the real thing. And yet it still remains as agile as this. Big square intakes of the General Electric F414 GE400 engines. And there's the condensation trails again, showing how much G Ricardo Traven is pulling with this aircraft. This next manoeuvre he calls an inverted pirouette. As he pulls the aircraft down, it's actually manoeuvring in 3 different dimensions all at the same time. And interestingly, it doesn't have ailerons on the wings. It uses the tailplane there to pitch the aircraft down and then differentially to make it roll. This aircraft first flew in 1995, but it's going into service now. There are 2 versions of the Super Hornet available. This is the 2-seat version, the F model, and there's a single-seat E model. Both of them perform all sorts of different missions: air-to-air combat, day-night, ground and sea strike with precision-guided weapons, fighter escort, close air support, maritime reconnaissance, forward air control, and they can even be tankers. Once this aircraft has finished its time on the display circuit in the hands of this wonderful Boeing test pilot, it'll be delivered to the carrier USS Abraham Lincoln, and it's marked in the squadron colours of VFA-2.
So that brings to an end another great Royal International Air Tattoo. And there is something about this show which sets it apart from all other air displays. It's not just the scale of the event, but the comradeship it seems to create between air crews and enthusiasts from all over the world. It seems that they come here not just to celebrate anniversaries, but the miracle of flight itself. For now, though, it's goodbye from RAF Fairford.